Welcome to episode 18 of the Alcon Maddox War Plan webinar series. Today I'm excited to be joined by Merit Bear. Merit is the Principal Security Architect of AWS, and her profile is so long, I think that ultimately all I can really say is that Merit is an authority on security. So we'll look forward to some really interesting insights on Merit in a little while. But look, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Richard Ritchie. I run a company based in the UAE called Alcon Maddox. It's a niche recruitment and executive search firm that's set up to serve the IT channel industry, commercial recruitment within the IT channel industry. Typical roles that we recruit for include sales managers, heads of sales, directors of sales, VPs of sales, and then also channel and partnership leadership positions as well. So just to be clear, the industries we cover within the IT channel are computer software, IT and services, computer and network security, computer and networking, telecommunications, and the internet. Now, having spent 25 years building and leading high-performing teams across the region, I know just how important it is to install the right commercial leader within an organization. Doing so has a direct impact on value, but can also have a direct impact on just how quickly you can break into a new market, open a new channel, or how easily you can protect revenues in times of crisis like today. So for those of you who want to gain insight into our proprietary system and the way we're able to identify the top 15% of passive talent in the market, just write the word talent in the chat box and I'll reach out to you for a private conversation in the next couple of days. Now, before we get into the topic of the day, Merit, why don't you now take a couple of moments to just explain perhaps a little bit more about who you are for those who don't know you, and what it is you do at AWS.
Sure. So I am a principal security architect. I'm in the office of the CISO at AWS. So that means that I work with customers on how to secure themselves in the cloud. And I also have sort of unique visibility into how AWS protects itself in the cloud. Of course, AWS runs on AWS, as does the rest of Amazon.
On Azure,
It seems kind of silly, and yet when you think about that, actually, it's quite fascinating. If you're thinking about our engineers, innovating and producing at scale, and then running their infrastructure for, development cycles, for, communications with customers, for billing and operations, for our own HR. Whatever, I mean, like all of these different elements from the customer facing side to the internal operational side are run on AWS. So I have kind of a foot in both worlds. I deal directly with customers and try to help them secure themselves on, the customer side of the model, if you will. And then I also work with AWS security to secure ourselves running on AWS. So it's an interesting vantage point, and to some extent, what we is best practices that we would tell a customer to do, right? So these are not totally foreign worlds, but they are a little bit of a unique vantage point. I came to Amazon from US government. I had been doing security on behalf of the people. And for those in the US who are watching the election, my empathy is with you. And before that, ran my own small shop and have a law degree by background. So I've come from a lot of different perspectives. As you mentioned, always been a security expert, and I've always invested in seeing how companies and consumers own the problems in the landscape and how we can help raise the water level.
Absolutely. Like you say, it's a really interesting vantage point you sit on at the moment. But I think it's obviously a very good endorsement. It gives you a degree of integrity. Everything you're advocating, you do it yourself, right? It's not like we have another client who's done X, Y, Z, we recommend you follow them. This is what we do. We know it works. We believe in our own infrastructure. So this is how you can get the most out of it. It's just like, a BMW, you're not a BMW salesman, of course, but I mean, someone who works with BMW selling BMWs it's not an issue, right? But if they were selling Volkswagens or Jaguars, you'd question, do you believe in what you actually have? So yeah, so it's obviously a great bonus point, but an interesting, right. Certainly an interesting decision to sit, right?
Yeah, there's always that cliche about eating your own dog food, or sometimes we say drinking our own champagne. I think that it actually is that we struggle with the same things, right? I mean, like we can relate. We are one of the most sophisticated shops, and so some of what we're doing is, you know, sort of next generation stuff. But at the same time, you know, security is a process; it's not an end state. And so, like the things that work through you know, these are just kind of the best approach we've found, and some of these are really transformational, but they're also you know, human. Ultimately, we work through these problems as well. And so I think it's always actually just you know, keeps us down to earth to be navigating some of the, you know, same issues that we know our customers do.
100%. You know, it's actually quite funny. So in this conversation when we had last week as well, you kept using a word shop, and shop to me sounds or implied something quite small, but you obviously refer to your previous businesses, your clients, and also AWS as shop. And it's just, it's for me, it's almost quite a romantic term to some extent. It sounds very small, but actually it's a pretty grand scale, right? Is that a common word you find you use within the industry? You refer to businesses within the industries as shops, workshops, I guess?
Yeah, I think I hadn't noticed that I use that term, but yeah, it makes sense. I think I'm thinking of security shops too. You know, I'm thinking of the part of your business that is dedicated to security, or that is tasked to, at least with security. And for that, you know, there's lots of variance in verticals and geographies and the kinds of particularities that come with your data protection or other considerations there. But ultimately, there's also a lot of sort of shared experiences. And so I think that, yeah, I mean, we're talking about a really large scale execution in our case of like large scale physical infrastructure, but actually our security org, you know, is pretty lean, and I think most places are. So if part of this whole venture, if you will, is allowing yourself to do the, you know, most bang for buck, and part of that is through automation and other forms of kind of maturing your operations. But at the end of the day, like our shop is, I think, relatively small. I mean, we do a lot with the tools that that you can augment to allow yourself to get good ROI.
Yeah, excellent. So look, let's move on to the topic of discussion today. So I obviously rephrase the title of the session, how much cybersecurity is enough. But I think the reality is what the way I think you want to come at it is more along the lines of what are the key indications of a mature security organization? And I think when we were discussing the other week, there are three principles or strategies, if you like. They were DevSecOps, Zero Trust, and next gen security operations. So let's take one each one at a time. Starting with DevSecOps. First of all, what is DevSecOps? Is this just a made-up term? Is this an actual division?
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't like the term DevSecOps because it's a little bit of a forced verbiage here. But I think the idea, of course, is that folks traditionally would have a DevOps structure where they're moving from waterfall to agile, and so they're moving from these longer term, fairly scripted development cycles where they've got these deliverables that are articulated, 6 months or a year or whatever in advance, and the development team pushes long and hard against the same goals and then drops off a deliverable and then evaluates it and puts security against it at the end. That instead you actually change your entire sort of innovation cycle of the company, that you're doing these short sprints, you're in agile methodology, so you're constantly reevaluating your requirements and you're constantly reevaluating your deliverables. And as you do that, this is in some ways inherently cloudy, just the development cycle itself, right? Just to be doing things where you're spinning up and down and you're taking advantage of the scalability and flexibility and elasticity of someone else providing the physical infrastructure. This was, I think, is really only achievable if you're leveraging cloud. But then on top of that, there is this element of the way that security looks in cloud, right? Where you're not just tacking on security at the end of a development cycle, you're hopefully weaving it throughout and sort of democratizing the ownership of security into your development teams. So people, you can structure it. You kind of asked, do you have a DevSecOps division? We don't. We have whatever we're building, but they are exhibiting these behaviors where you've got these short development cycles with security woven throughout it, and also with kind of a universal ownership model for security. So instead of it being someone's job after the fact to examine it, you've got this kind of continuous process of securing your development cycles.
Okay, so as I understand it, then it's more a framework of thinking or a philosophy, if you like.
Yes,
regarding the
I would
sorry.
I would say it's more like a culture, right? But to have a culture, you have to exhibit those behaviors. Like you can't just say, I'm going to be a DevOps shop and then put out a newsletter and call yourselves that. I mean, you can, but it doesn't make it true. I think, to actually have it be your culture, you must exhibit some of these behaviors. And these include.
Is that the key challenge then? Because what I wanted to understand is, what's the biggest barrier for executing this way? Is it the culture? Is it getting the culture right to get everyone's buy-in to that, mutual importance of function?
Yeah, I think there's a couple reasons that this can be a challenge. One is just that it's a new way of doing stuff. So your old cycles that were like these longer term, I think that folks, especially if they're used to budgeting for that, if they're used to just even the developers, this puts a huge urgency and kind of stress on your dev teams because they're constantly reevaluating their deliverables. And that can be an uncomfortable thing to change over to. It is not necessarily something that the humans will immediately love. Although I think, as you shift that culture, folks get more, comfortable, like it being in a state of a bit of flux, that is just the usual state of play once you're in this kind of new cultural reality. But yeah, I mean, I think I think the cultural shift is the challenge, but the way to get a cultural shift is to start exhibiting those behaviors. Like in some sense, culture is just what you do and what you want to be doing, and how your leadership articulates goals around that. And so I would say, start small, right? Start doing it somewhere. It's easier to 5 pounds than 30. Start exhibiting the behaviors, put in elements of this into your cycles, and then and hire people who like to automate things and, grow your shop into sort of like a machine that has mechanisms versus a product of the personalities that happen to be there at any given time.
Yeah. So as I get it, so it's an amalgamation of different disciplines within the same unit, singing on the same hymn sheet, let's say. But then, if you're now building your team with this in mind, would you favor one discipline over another? Do you find that, for example, someone from Dev or Sec is better, or their mindset is easier adapted to this way of thinking?
So I think that in my perfect world, we would all breathe some of this in, right? We would all, whether you're, if you're a security person, you don't get to walk away from the deliverables and the goals of the organization. You don't get to be a no person if you're in security. You have to figure out how to build it with the awareness that you want it to have. And vice versa for the DevOps folks, right? So you're going to want to be getting the real buy-in from your users and from your developers. I think that in practice, the way that people create this kind of culture, it varies. It kind of depends on what your business is. But ultimately, I think this is like a marriage of worlds that I feel strongly about in general, which is that in any sophisticated incarnation, you can't silo your security shop and your development shop and hope that you independently come up with something that is both secure and innovative. Ultimately,
yeah, not going to be the last people that get to touch the product either, right? They've got to be involved in it a lot earlier on in order to, well, to stop the roadblocks, I guess, to some extent, you know, to fix it as you go rather than just give it to the end person and say, well, it's their fault for not passing it. So, and that's, you said that was pretty much the way, well, AWS has been structured in that way already, right? So not the security is at the end, but in order to get things signed off, it has to go through security, and you built it, and it's been set up in that way to make sure nothing slips through the cracks.
Yeah, I would say that is true, although that's not how we think of it. We think of it as, you know, like just the way you approach security has changed. So even if you wanted to bolt it on after the fact, that's not going to get you the kind of multi-layered security that you're looking for with like a defense in depth. Yep. So, and in cloud, as you know, there's like, you know, you've got users and roles and resource policies, and you've got, you know, are you in a VPC? Do you have an endpoint? Do you have an endpoint policy? These things actually like are woven through the, you know, the architectural decisions and the configurations that you've made are not something that you can just adjust at the end. This decision making is part of your build cycle. And so there are, you know, on the positive side here, you're seeing, you know, defense in depth, and you're seeing more interesting sort of tools to be able to evaluate the reachability of your network and the possible escalation paths of your permissions, for example. But in practice, what that means is that you have to be kind of weaving your security throughout your build cycles.
Yeah, rather than just build it and put a fence around it. That's no longer the attitude, right?
Right.
Okay, fine. So let's then move on to guys. For those listening, if you have any questions or insights, please do drop them in the chat box now. What I'd like to do now is move on to the second area or second strategy as far as you know, maturing security organization, and that's regarding zero trust. Now, zero trust. It's my understanding that zero trust has actually been around since 2010. So why are we only now starting to hear about it, or is it just me? Have I been living in a cave for the last 10 years?
No, it's a totally fair question, and I think the short answer is like you know, it's gotten a lot of buzz lately. So if someone's trying to sell you a particular, you know, product that they call zero trust, like that's not a thing. But I think it can be a helpful conceptual tool, and I was sort of getting at this, you know, by the end of our back and forth on DevSecOps, that, you know, the idea with zero trust is that while first of all, the term itself means different things to different people, but what we have found useful is to think of it in terms of, you know, not prioritizing the identity-centric or the perimeter-centric controls, but using both, and ideally having them augment one another and be aware of one another. So you can think of this in terms of identity-centric verifications, like our SIG-v4 signing process. Every API call from AWS, in theory, goes over the open internet. And so it's somewhat remarkable, right? And then at the same time, that doesn't mean that you don't use VPC or VPNs for that matter. Like the idea that you have some kind of perimeter that filters out unnecessary noise and gives you, you know, fewer things to worry about also works together. So I mean, we've used terms like defense in depth for a long time. I think zero trust, in my mind, is a little bit Princess Bride-y. Like, I do not think that word means what you think it means, because obviously you wouldn't want to network with actual zero trust. I mean, to do that, you just cut your power cord, right? But what you want is something like appropriate trust. And to do that, I think it's a helpful model to think through how to deprioritize your network location being the identifying quality about you in terms of whether you get access or not, which is kind of like the traditional model was that you would be, your permissions would be based on your location in the network.
Yeah.
So I think moving beyond that is part of this kind of growing up, and I think it's a helpful just a conceptual tool to be able to think through what's the appropriate level, if you will, of permissiveness and layering on those kinds of augmenting controls. And we can see this from the end user perspective, like you getting access to devices and how many layers is appropriate for you to be able to get into something. And you can think of it also in the machine software to software conversation, if you will, communications there. Either way, we're looking at some kind of tandem between those network centric and those identity centric controls.
Yeah, got it. So in your experience, what because you work with a lot of clients of AWS, which companies or types of companies, if you want to put it that way, have been changing their security architecture as a result of COVID-19?
I think a lot of customers are changing their day-to-day operations because one part of their business requires more now or is thriving while another one is not as busy as they had anticipated. This has been an unusual year, obviously. And I think we definitely see lessons from customers who have been able to quickly change their architectures or change their, investment in their anticipated revenue over the next year or 5 years. And I think, they're taking advantage of some of that elasticity. I don't have particular customers that come to mind that have overhauled everything, but, if you think about some of our large customers, Netflix is a really sophisticated security shop and they're all in on AWS.
Yeah.
Well, are they seeing the same kinds of behavior? Maybe not, but their business is doing fine. It's just adjusting. People are maybe, they are probably adjusting to the new reality where people are using their home devices as BYODs more and are maybe logged into Netflix while also downloading other things from their work, whatever. They're thinking through our behaviors in this new reality. And, every company that I know is doing that. There's lots of movement, I think, in this, current landscape. Folks are adjusting, but that's a benefit of cloud is that you can.
Yeah, 100%. I think it was really interesting a few weeks ago, it might have been a month or two ago now, when Siemens came out and announced that they were allowing, I think it was something like 135,000 employees across Europe to work from home indefinitely for at least a few days a week. And I thought that was a really bold decision in that, when you put when it's time bound, when you say everyone will be back to work by Christmas, for example, there's almost an implied reluctance to accept the reality this is going to be a long-term thing. But the fact that these guys have now done that, I was just interested to understand from your perspective, what gates do you think these guys must have moved through in order to allow that to happen, that perhaps other companies are yet to do? Does that make sense?
My perception of those decisions is just like me as a human walking through the world, not as a security expert. I don't think that those decisions have mostly hinged on their perception of whether they can be secure working from home. I really think it's their sort of cultural attachment to the idea of office work, and in some cases for good reason, right? I miss being in front of a whiteboard with other people in person. There are some that are just not that easy to do remotely, and I get it. I think, our developers miss being able to code over each other's shoulders. There are some activities that are really easier or are more comfortable to do in person. So I think those are struggling with how to execute on their responsibilities. I don't perceive that the barrier to going back is their security considerations from at-home work. Although, of course, they need to navigate that. That to some extent, this is stuff that companies would have had to think about anyway. Even if 10% of your workforce is working from home, you have to have your security configured. And 10% would not be enough to just allow to fall off the rails either. So I don't think that it is security that is driver for whether folks can come into the office. I think it is really just the kind of business, cultural, budget, whatever, risk management conversations that are happening. And those, like you say, you know, companies are taking different approaches, and no one has a playbook for this. So I think everyone's just trying to figure out the best they can.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment. We've got a couple of questions come in. So first one from Apollinaire. I'll just read this out to you, Merritt. So in the Middle East, traditionally security teams are resisting the move to clouds, including AWS, as they see their jobs will become obsolete with automation, or their dev colleagues will take over security. The reality is it is more challenging than first appears to secure cloud deployments, and it looks like security specialists will still be needed. There is a limit to what can be achieved through automation. What do you say to that? I know you're a fan of automation.
Yeah, so I would say I agree. I think that first of all, you don't have to like rely on job security just because cloud is a challenge to secure. I mean, it is true that, you know, there will always be new challenges, but I don't think that you need to like worry that we're going to obfuscate things and that's what's going to create jobs. I actually think that you know, just the nature of security work may change, but I think that should be an exciting thing, right? I mean, if it's something that a computer can do, we should let the computer do it. That doesn't mean that there will be no need for humans. So for instance, today, you know, we talk about Werner Vogel, our CTO, says, get the humans away from the machines. And what he means, you should automate as much as you can. Like, humans make human errors, you know, machines, if it's something that can be programmed, then you should allow the machine to do the, you know, kind of bulletproof math that machines only can do. And so one example of this is thresholding for security controls. So you want to have minimized that gray space of human decision making down to, you know, the very novel or very high stakes scenarios. So you would have, whatever your source of truth is, as you, and it's more than one, but if you're using AWS native tools, you're talking about CloudTrail for your API calls, CloudWatch for your CPU usage, config for configuration drift, and so on. Any of the dashboarding tools can be accompanied by, or, you know, augmented by remediation tools. So they can not only trigger, you know, alerting and alarming, but they can also literally script their own automated remediations. So config rules or CloudWatch events, or just a simple Lambda function, which all of those are Lambda functions under the hood, actually. But use remediation to, you know, take an action on the security events that you're seeing when they hit a certain threshold. And that allows for, you know, this human decision-making window to be really minimized. And that's the way that you can do security at scale, right? That you don't have to manually do everything. Of course, that may mean that
it's away from the computers.
yeah, like, you don't want to manual stuff, right? So this is actually, in some sense, I perceive this as moving the security job family from, you know, being the curmudgeons to be more transcendental. Like, how do we think about what the next incarnation of like math will be, and how do we then secure our networks using that? So one example, we have a team called the Automated Reasoning Group, and this is a group of like math PhDs, and they take formal methods, which is basically like formal math, and they apply that to you know, infrastructure as code, because then you can do security as code. So you can take, for example, identity and access management policies, and these look like lines of, you know, like a cloud formation template will have, you know, something that assigns users and roles and spins up. Like, you don't even have to write this yourself. There are plenty of templates. Then the Automated Reasoning Group has tools that can evaluate, like, what are escalation paths, which one is more, which policy is more permissive than another. That's a tool called Zelkova. There's another tool called Tiros that does network reachability. So without sending a single packet over the network, it can tell you whether you have, for example, internet-facing endpoints. And it does this by code. And so it tells you, although in the back end, like on the AWS side, there are racks and stacks of servers still. On the customer side, what you're experiencing is just through that console, through that dashboard, right? And so that's just code. And you can then allow a computer to parse that. And it gives you scopeable problems that you can then know, as a matter of fact, a yes/no statement about your networks. So really cool tools. These are only possible in this kind of like new world where you've got security as code.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love all that. One of the other things you mentioned the other day, which I thought was really fascinating. Well, fascinating for me because I've worked within a tech environment before where band-aids would be wrapped around every problem we came across. A couple of years down the line, you're just left with this. We need to just unwrap everything and start again. Whereas you don't have this at AWS, right? You'll get a problem and you'll fix it once, so that the problem never happens again, right? What is it? You used a term for that, I think, when we discussed it last week. How did you explain it? Because I thought it was, when I heard that, I was like, yes, I'd love to work in that environment.
Yeah, so this kind of leads us into our third category here, which is like, how do you grow up your SOC, your security operations team, to exhibit some of these sort of next generation behaviors? How do you make your team a machine, like something that is larger than the individual people, and something that has replicable mechanisms that exhibit the kind of cultural behaviors you want to have? One example is that we never, every shop, including ours, is still captive to some kind of trouble ticketing system. So hopefully you've got a low latency, fully API driven trouble ticketing system. But we never close a trouble ticket until we've scripted the remediation. So the idea is only solve the same problem once and never twice. And that it just builds this culture of solving for not just that instance, but for all future incarnations of that problem, if possible. Another way we exhibit that is in the fact that Steve Schmidt, our CISO, reports directly to the CEO, Andy Jassy. So this means that he can never be sort of overpowered or one-upped by a business leader who says like, oh, we're going to make all this money from this product, let's get it out, before it's reviewed for security. There's no going over the head of the security domain. And I think plenty of shops will say that they care about security. 100% of executives will say they care about security, but to actually have the political will to hold the business accountable and to prioritize security, like to actually give it a vantage point where it can stand against, toe-to-toe with any of the other business objectives, is a affirmative decision.
Yeah, no, I've experienced a similar mentality, not so much on the security side, but on the customer centricity side, when businesses are trying to transition from a more of a commercial or monetization strategy towards customer centricity, which obviously implies that you're going to take a hit, at least short term, to monetization. It's all very good talking about it, but then at the next board meeting, when you're questioned on why you're off budget, suddenly people aren't so customer centric. But obviously, what you're doing with the security side of things makes 100% sense. But like you said, it's weaving that into the culture of the organization. I think, as you mentioned earlier on, is key. We've got a couple of other questions, Merritt, I want to just make sure we cover here. So Ibrahim says, within AWS Security Hub, which approach or methodology you recommend to follow? AWS Detective or AWS Inspector?
So those are all different services. So Security Hub is ideally anyway, sort of a single pane of glass. You can pull in your results from Detective and Inspector and GuardDuty and CloudTrail and CloudWatch. These are all different sort of sources of truth. So my recommendation for an approach with Security Hub would be to decide how you're going to get your mail, right? Like a lot of times folks, whether it's AWS or whether they have another vendor, a Splunk or whatever, and they're paying for it and they're You know, it has a pretty dashboard. Like, okay, what do you do about it? Like, where are your run books? How do you decide that you're going to take a guard duty finding and act on it? And we are increasingly, you know, giving folks the tools to click through and be able to, like, you know, remediate natively, to just like click through the dashboard. But that has to come from a decision. Like you still need to make those run books. We can give all the building blocks to allow you to build automations, but you still got to make those judgment calls for your shop. So I would say, you know, my advice would be to, if you don't already have this in place, to sort of like hit the pause button, metaphorically, with your security shop. Like, set aside some resources to go through and walk through run books. Like, what do we do about this? And how do we, you know, I mentioned thresholding and then automations. Like, you have to write those, and those come from judgment calls. And you should have executive sponsorship for your political will to enforce those judgment calls. So this is going to, you know, not just your security team making some calls here and talking to your developers to say, like, if we were to kill non-compliant architectures every, you know, 15 minutes, how would that impact you? Or would you know to come ask us what was the issue here? And then all the way, you know, filtering that all the way up to your executive sponsors and saying, here's what our plan is. We're going to, you know, allow these forms of risk, but only with these parameters or whatever. You know, different shops have different preferences in terms of how they want to guardrail and enforce their security decisions. But I think the point is, like, get some, you know, get that process in place, and start getting buy-in for your judgment calls, and get those run books in place, because getting the mail is not useful unless you know what you're going to do with it.
Yeah, 100%. Another question from Amelie. So what, in your view, is where companies are typically most at risk, especially keeping COVID and home office workers in mind? Data storage or communication?
You know, this would all just be speculation. So I think it sounds like a lawyer answer, but I think it depends what business, right? I think that one of the advantages of cloud should be that you have really full visibility into your assets. So you no longer have to worry about a rogue server under someone's desk. You know, like, you really have arms around your architectures and your assets. And I think then having a classification and understanding what your crown jewels are, and putting policies around those that are probably different from those that you put around others, you know, like, have a dev and a test environment, you know, sandbox things that you want to allow people to run around and do funny things with, and never put them into prod. You know, like, it's really about not just like micro segmentation within everything you do, but just a different, it probably requires a set of value judgments around the different parts of your business. And you know, that will look different for a pharma company than it will for a retail company. But ultimately, I mean, I think so of course there are bad actors out there, and we know about some APT groups, and we know about, like, these MOs and stuff, but I don't focus too much on particular threat actors. I actually think of it as the like, this would be your kind of holistic approach to your own environment. Like, you own these decisions. So, because, like, putting up a shield in this direction and a shield in that direction does not work as well as just ensuring that you've got a more holistic strategy. So I think, you know, it'll have to be tailored, but I think that you'd want to evaluate where, you know, what are folks going to be after. So you'll want to be especially cautious with regulated data, with money, information, you know, the usual stuff. But I don't think there's any, like, one silver bullet here.
Yeah, understood. Another question from Taha. So is there a point of diminishing returns on cybersecurity spending for any given organization?
It's an interesting question. I actually even struggle with the idea of putting a specific number on how much you spend on security.
Yeah.
So, for example, like our all of EC2 runs on Nitro instances, which is our custom hardware, which has a lot of security benefits. But like, would we call that security spending? Like you're going to have investments on your business side that maybe allow you to move faster, have more visibility, escalate things with, less pain, whatever the issue is. And I think I certainly think that it is worthwhile to look at what you're spending on today that falls within your like cybersecurity vendors. And at the very least say, are we using all the capabilities we're paying for? Are we getting everything we could from this vendor in terms of just being able to leverage the money you're already spending? In terms of, looking at the future trajectory of how much to spend, like, sure, I think that there could be, diminishing returns because ultimately you're only capable of doing something about so many pieces of information in the ecosystem, right? But I don't think it's like a linear relationship between spend. You see folks, you see some shops that are doing really kind of transcendental work with fairly native tools and doing a lot sort of with the Lego set that they have instead of buying a Barbie dream house that's already pre-constructed from a vendor. I think yes, probably there is diminishing returns, but I don't think that it's a linear relationship between spend and security anyway. I think it takes, it's unfortunately, I again don't have the silver bullet here, but I think the most useful thing here is probably just to go back, look at what you're paying for today and see what you're getting from there. And if you have elements of vendors that I often see overlap, like they're paying one vendor for, this type of dashboarding and another for that type, and actually they each do the other thing. So make sure that each unique vendor that you have a relationship with is actually necessary. I would, encourage folks to look where they can lean up their security spend.
Maybe just as an extension of that question, do you find when you consult with companies that they have a security budget that they have to stick to, or is it more a case of, okay, what do we need, and whatever we need we'll find the money for, and then obviously there's then I guess the kind of point of diminishing returns comes in, where there's nice to have things that in a good year we pay for, and others really there's not a big enough risk to warrant spend.
I think it depends on the executive sponsorship for security at that shop. So I think it depends what the marching orders have been, and some of it is just dependent on like existing relationships. So they've been paying for this for 5 years and now they just don't even notice it anymore. So I think doing a little shakeup of your vendor landscape, like what are we paying for, what are we actually using, is there anywhere that we should be trimming, and then by the same token, are there things we should be buying that we don't have today? I think that is a conversation that every security organization should have at least annually, and really be transparent with themselves about what they're using and not, and what the capabilities are for the vendors they're already paying. I don't see like one particular pattern of good or bad behavior there. I think most places are really trying to do their best. The budgeting cycles, it just depends. And I think that, this is one of the elements that we work with, obviously, customers on, because billing in cloud looks different. But for the most part, like whatever vendor you're attached to that you already love, whether it's Splunk or whatever, you can run that on AWS if you wanted. But of course, you would then be paying for another vendor. So I think it's, folks struggle with this, and it's for good reason. I empathize, and I think that it's a fair conversation, and there's no magic to it, except, as far as I can tell, except being pretty I was going to say harsh, being pretty deliberate about your reevaluation every year.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, cool. Look, just to revisit a point that we discussed when we had a chat last week, as I mentioned, we actually work with a lot of MSPs here in the UAE, and a challenge that we hear quite a lot of is that of mindset, specifically in relation to moving to cloud, so premise to cloud. Given what you know about security, I know you've actually mentioned before, I think the wording you actually used was security as a business differentiator of cloud. What kind of, I guess, anecdotal evidence would you use if you were to convince a company to switch to cloud?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what their hangups are. So
Yeah.
usually I ask, I'll ask like, what are you doing today, and what do you think is working well, and what's not? Where do you believe that you have gaps or that you could stand to grow? I ask, who's the driving force between your potential move to cloud? Like, is it your, R&D team? And if so, we just need to get your security team comfortable enough that the R&D team gets a green light, right? But I actually think that we are increasingly seeing, and for good reason, folks who are moving to cloud, at least in part because of security. So it's not just saying, yes, you get all these, innovation and productivity cycles out of cloud, and like you can run all your analytics and store all the data in the world. We'll get you secure enough. Instead, it is we perceive that for us to be a successful company in the next 20 to 100 years, we're going to need to scale, and we're going to need to do security at scale. And the only way that we're seeing folks do that effectively is in cloud. And I think, the attestations that I think are most powerful usually are our own. Like, how do you think that Amazon scales up so much and down, like, how do we accomplish our business goals? Amazon is such an intimate part, whether it's the packages that arrive at people's house, whether it's Amazon Prime or Twitch or care.com or Whole Foods or PillPack, like people, or even explicitly AWS, people, a lot of times AWS is like the quiet infrastructure provider, and people don't identify as much with it being part of their lives, but they certainly do with, some elements of the Amazon umbrella, and the knowledge that we're able to achieve our own business goals on AWS, I think, is an attestation to the fact that it can be done. Some of the Five Eyes governments that store information in AWS, I think, are an attestations like, oh, you think that your security tools are more stringent than the CIA? There are things that but this is where I don't think that it is it is a perception. It is not a reality that is holding them up. And so what we need to do is find out, this is really a business conversation where I need to figure out who on the other side is the decision maker, and who's the server, who I need to make comfortable here, or is it a lawyer? Is it a security person? Like, how do we talk to them on their terms, meet them where they are, and have a real conversation about what their concerns are and what their considerations are, and get them comfortable and get them to understand what the capabilities are, because I do think ultimately the security proposition of moving to cloud is a driver for why folks are in cloud.
It's interesting. I think the key driver, at least in this region, certainly during the pandemic period, from what we've seen, is that regarding flexibility and cost structure, right? And that has been, so it's not just, so with that in mind, it means that the conversation, like you said, about the decision maker perhaps in a lot of these situations is now perhaps the decision-making power is perhaps transferred from the CIO to the CEO, because the decision is now inherently more commercial than tech. But then that's almost saying that the security isn't at the forefront of the conversation. It's clearly going to be there, but maybe it needs to be brought closer to the front. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think we It depends on the context, right? We sometimes are the first conversation that a customer wants to have, and sometimes we are woven in with a lot of other like considerations and no more important than any of the others. But certainly, I don't know of a single customer for whom security was not a a necessary factor that they had to satisfy. So
Yeah.
whether or not the security team is, is going to explicitly block versus be excited. I mean, there have been customers where their security team are the ones that are bringing cloud into the organization, and they're saying, like, we're sick of babysitting servers. We don't want to do this. We don't want to
Yeah.
like hold everyone in the organization and try to, put a trouble ticket in for that. We want to automate more. We want to, make our own jobs look different.
Yeah.
Sorry, make our own jobs look different. Like we want to be the change agents, and that I think is legitimate. Like it is certainly true that in cloud you're able to do more with less. You're able to solve more interesting problems, and you're able to get a lot more, like I said, visibility and sort of tactile ownership over your network. So you can patch what feels like immediately. You can, enforce privilege decisions. You can, adjust permissions. You can, everything is an API call, so you can have a record of every attempted action on your network. Like there's just so much you can be doing. And if you then are using that to go into security, like to some extent today, our VP, Eric Brainwine, says security is just a big data problem. Are you looking at the right data? Are you able to do your analytics around your security data effectively? And I think that, speaks to the need for cloud as well.
One final question, because we're pretty much out of time, but it's just that regarding something you mentioned actually on a conference last week, and that was regarding talent pipeline and development. I just want a final word on that. So what is your opinion? I think you mentioned something along the lines of it's key to the evolving security infrastructure of organizations, right? Can you just expand on that a bit for us?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I usually try to, if I have the chance to speak to people publicly, it's one of the things that I try to bring up, which is just that, technology is human-made and security is therefore, imperfect and human-made too. And as we, so there's kind of two things here that are a call to action for the listeners. One is just to fill your own shop with people who think and approach problems differently. And we know it's true that people who have different life experiences code differently, that they, approach problems differently, and that will make your team stronger. So we know that tech and security in particular are not particularly diverse. And I really think that that is not any kind of like skills gap or external thing. I think it is the way that people get pulled into organizations. So making sure that you extend your sort of informal networks to pull in people who come from different backgrounds, who think differently and approach the world differently. And by that same token, we at Amazon, well, one, we're always hiring, but two, we welcome feedback. So, problems, things like watch your VPC flow logs for anomalies turned into guard duty, the service. S3 promiscuity turned into S3 block public access as a setting. So, where there is feedback that you are seeing that we don't see, feel free to bring that. We are always listening to customer feedback and to, the landscape. So feel free to reach out anytime. I'm personally, I'm available on Twitter and on email. And AWS support is actually quite responsive as well. So, this is a process, and as such, the people who construct the next stage of these decisions are as good as the technologies. So we really appreciate the ability to weave in perspectives from our customers.
Excellent. Listen, Mel, I just want to say thank you once again. I know we've run over time. I really enjoyed today's session. I've actually learned an incredible lot, which is great. You've obviously got a lot more to do now. I think you've probably got a busy day ahead, given how early it is. Look, for those on the call, as I mentioned earlier on, if you'd like to receive a copy of the white paper, just type the word white paper in the chat box, and when that's available next week, I'll make sure we get a copy sent across to yourselves. Also, if you'd like to become a member of the mastermind community I mentioned, again, just type the word mastermind in the chat box, and I'll reach out to you in the next couple of days to have a one-on-one conversation about what we're doing there, okay? So that's it for today. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining. Merritt, can you just stay online for 2 more minutes for a quick debrief? That's it. Thanks a lot, guys. Take care. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.